And I found that Ethereum was exactly mirroring Bitcoin. When I say exactly, when I look at it on a plot graph with the same regression, it looks similar, but because it started later, it just follows Bitcoin earlier. But in fact, its adoption, i.e. the number of wallets at this time, is actually a faster rate of adoption than Bitcoin had. But what's super interesting is when you go back and match them from 1 million active wallet addresses each, their prices are identical and their price movements have been identical. And that took me by surprise. I didn't expect to see that because that normally doesn't happen. You have to fit the graphs, but it perfectly fit in every way. It's exactly currently in the 2017 run-up that Bitcoin had. And at exactly the same time, after it hit 1 million wallets, it gives you something similar. So that's when I say ETH equals Bitcoin, is because when you think of it in macro terms, they're both really network effects. And so they may have very different properties. There may be different things entirely. And people struggle with value when it comes to network effects. Almost everybody underestimates value by definition, because we try and anchor it on something that we perceive as value. But network effects are so hard to think in because they're exponential.
Okay, so Lyn, you have a totally different conclusion after writing like an extremely well-researched piece on all the ins and outs of Ethereum. So based on that extensive research, you concluded that you would not invest in Ethereum at this time. So what factors led you to that decision?
Yeah, so one thing I'd point out is I don't really view my position as opposite of Raoul. I actually think there's a ton of overlap. It's just not a perfect overlap. And the way I kind of look at it is, so for example, in the article, the overall conclusion is that I could see a non-zero allocation to Ethereum as making sense. And so I gave, for example, 80% Bitcoin, 20% Ethereum, or 90% Bitcoin, 10% Ethereum, or 100 to 0. I think there's still a case to kind of focus on Bitcoin, which is what I'm preferring to do. But I also point out that if Ethereum were to break over 1400, which now as of this recording it has, that's pretty bullish for the price action during a bull market in a broad sense. So it's not necessarily that I'm bearish on the price in any kind of given 6 or 12 month period. It's more about outlining various pros and cons and then kind of sharing some of the concerns I had. And so I do agree that it is the really the one other protocol that does have a substantial network effect. And so that's pretty much undisputable because so many tokens run on Ethereum now. There's so much development happening on Ethereum. And so in my kind of mind, I think that the big concern is to make sure in some ways we separate the growth of the ecosystem from the growth of price in the long term. And because you can be, for example, very bullish on the amount of value that's settled on Ethereum, the amount of smart contracts that happen on Ethereum, and then have a somewhat different view on what happens to actual Ethereum token appreciation over the long run when you include bullish and bearish cycles. And what I mean by that is, for example, if you look back during the 2017 high, since then, about 3 times as much value settles on Ethereum, and the market cap is still just roughly back to where it was. And that for an Ethereum bull, what you then argue is that therefore Ethereum's undervalued, and therefore that's kind of a bull case for Ethereum. A somewhat different view is, for people that aren't familiar, John Pfeffer wrote a paper back in late 2017, kind of highlighting this problem. And his argument was that the utility protocols, even if they are used for a lot of, kind of ecosystem GDP, you could call it, if they're used for a variety of things, that the value won't necessarily accrue to those tokens. Basically, you can have a high velocity, and that there basically might not be kind of a quote unquote moneyness associated with those tokens in the long term. It doesn't preclude those from being moneyness. If we see things like more and more collateralization of Ethereum, if you see a strong preference towards staking and kind of enough people wanted to hodl it as money, it can still become money. But basically, there's somewhat of a separate argument about the size of the ecosystem and the price of the tokens in the long run. Although I do agree, I think in many points that I can see why a lot of people want to have a position in Ethereum, and I can also see that it does so far have a substantial network effect. And I think one of the challenges going forward is how Ethereum is going to transition, because Bitcoin is, for the most part, a finished product. It's still evolving, just like any other finished product. Like they're still making updates to Adobe Photoshop, for example, but it's in like
and Microsoft Word.
Exactly, but they're released things. Whereas Ethereum, because they're still doing radical changes to the underlying protocol, and they're as they shift from Ethereum 1 to Ethereum 2, they go from proof of work to proof of stake. They're changing some of the dynamics because they're running into these scaling problems. Basically, there's just a lot more implementation risk, I think. And so you're kind of getting a higher risk investment. And, I'm kind of open about whether or not it's higher reward. And that's why my preference was I can see why people like it, but that my view is I still like the risk reward of Bitcoin the best.
And, to be fair, Lyn and I would probably have roughly similar allocations for the same reason. When we look at asset allocation terms, there's three main metrics we use. One is liquidity preference. So Bitcoin has liquidity preference. So it's our base in this bet in the digital asset space. The next is time preference. Well, Bitcoin has been around longer. It also has a more understandable both network effect and value proposition. So you tend to hold it longer. But risk preference, and Ethereum has both of those, but not quite as superior as Bitcoin. Risk preference, there is because it's earlier in its network effects, the chances of more exponential price rises are higher. So you need a smaller allocation to have roughly similar effects in the portfolio. So we kind of agree. The one thing I did want to mention was that John Pfeffer paper. I kind of wrote a long article about it. Both of those things, firstly, he kind of said that the network effect didn't apply to anything except Bitcoin, which I think has been proven wrong. But the other one is he used the quantity theory of money, which basically we threw out in about 1981. And I worry that trying to look at these in terms of moneyness is trying to compare Bitcoin with an apple. They're kind of not the same thing. I cannot...
Raoul, can you explain what the quantity theory of money is?
Well, this is this MV equals PQ way of looking at, and that's why we talk about velocity of money, because that was one of the reasons the whole thing fell apart. And you're trying to figure out what the overall value of the money proposition is within this. And I'm not sure any of that applies. And that was my issue with John Pfeffer's paper. I thought it was really interesting, but I spent a long time thinking about it. I thought, that doesn't work in the real world. I mean, there is literally zero correlation between money supply and inflation. So that kind of throws all of his arguments, all of that kind of Friedman stuff out of the window. So I looked at it and thought, well, what is the difference here? I think he's arguing the case for Bitcoin about Bitcoin as a reserve asset, and then saying basically nothing else looks like that. And guess what? Nothing else looks like Bitcoin. And that's why we love Bitcoin. It has a unique value proposition in the world. And many of these other protocols have their own unique value propositions. Many of them will not get network effect. And some that we don't even know of now will have massive network effects. It's the same happened with the internet, same happened with mobile phone networks and almost any other network that we've seen.